Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are at this moment. My name is Radha Barua. I am a part of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and it is my honor to welcome you to this OC24 panel on a very topical issue of environmental organized crime. I request all attendees to use the Q&A feature to post your questions, which will be addressed in the last 15 minutes following all the presentations. Our panelists today will present their research undertaken in diverse regions from Eastern and Southern Africa to China and Russia, discussing various trends and issues such as the convergence of wildlife crime with other transnational illicit economies, the main issues and dynamics of illicit natural resource economies, the role of transnational criminal organizations in these economies, and criminal law versus environmental direct action in democratic societies. Without further ado, I'm pleased to invite our first speaker, Alistair Nelson, who's a senior analyst at the Global Initiative and the managing director of Conservation Synergies. Alistair has over 25 years of experience leading conservation programs in the Horn of Africa, East and Southern Africa, and has several publications on the topic. Today, Alistair will present on the convergence of wildlife crime and other forms of transnational organized crime in the East and Southern Africa. Alistair.
Good morning, or morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks, Radha. Thanks for the introduction. So as Radha said, I'll be presenting on some work we did on crime convergence, looking at the illegal wildlife trade. So looking at links between IWT and other illicit economies in Southern Africa, East and Southern Africa, and looking at case studies and then some analysis of that and then some recommendations. So our research was conducted under an INL funded, so US Department of State funded grant through the Global Initiative from January 2021 to August 2022. We did 105 interviews across 10 countries initially, and those 10 countries are highlighted on that map in East and Southern Africa. And those interviews included with law enforcement officers who worked on illegal wildlife trade and in wildlife crime units and intelligence investigation units, as well as law enforcement officers who worked in addressing drugs crime, human trafficking, etc., NGOs. And then a colleague of mine we had less formal interviews with people actually involved in some of the illicit economies as well. After that, we delved into 5 detailed case studies, which I'll highlight here. And those are in the sort of redder colored countries. So Uganda, we looked at a case study between Malawi and Mozambique, in South Africa and in Madagascar as well. Key things that we found, and some of this sort of that underpinned how we analyzed the work, was that obviously we know that crime convergence occurs where criminal relationships have matured. We found that corruption and illicit financial flows were ubiquitous. So we didn't actually consider a link between corruption and illicit financial flow as convergence. So that those things have to happen for organized crime to occur. So both of them. So we didn't actually look at illicit financial flows as convergence. We looked for another form of convergence within an illicit economy. We found that most convergence occurs further along the value chain. So in what we were looking at, the illicit wildlife trade, the illegal wildlife trade, we found that is more associated with trafficking than with the poaching and the killing and the extraction of the illegal product. There are important exceptions to this, and I'll highlight these. We also found that the illicit wildlife trade networks were less vertically integrated than other organized crime types, again with one important exception. And so what that means is that we found them much more a series of interlinked businesses operating, moving a product from one place to another, each one with their skill at either finding the product, poaching or extracting the product, trafficking it, and then selling it, whatever it might have been, but much less vertically integrated, as I said, except with one important exception. So in doing this work, we actually ended up with our own functional classification of convergence, and that's a copy of the report cover, which came out in April this year. So the first is we basically classified convergence as network convergence. Network convergence is when we saw the same organized criminal networks trading in multiple commodities. The second functional classification we used was hub convergence, where we see multiple commodities from different networks passing through a transport hub or another bottleneck, often with the support of a corrupt facilitator. And then later, we came across something that we defined as broker convergence. And this was when we were actually looking for illicit products and convergence in a couple of places. And we found that when we spoke with the local brokers involved in illicit economies, they could source multiple illicit products from various criminal economies. So if we were talking to somebody who knew how to get heroin, and we started asking them about wildlife products, they were able to access wildlife products or gold or whatever it might have been. So they knew how to get into those networks basically and find products locally. And this is that's typically lower in the criminal value chain. That's sort of a source area. So typically in a capital city or in an important city close to where the goods are being are coming from, or that they're transiting through, or where there's a local market, for example, like heroin. So overall, we found less network convergence than expected, which was surprising for us because there's a lot in the press about sort of network convergence with the illicit wildlife trade in particular. But we found that hub and broker convergence was pervasive. Everywhere we looked for it, we found it. In network convergence, I'll just go into our case studies. I'll go into the abalone in a separate slide afterwards. So abalone in South Africa and the convergence on the trade there from the poaching, the trafficking across to Asia. First, a few more words on the illegal wildlife trade and the heroin economy. So this is one that has occurred. We hear about a lot, and it's something that obviously the east coast of Africa down all the way down to the southeast is a major heroin trafficking route from the Makran coast, from coming out of Afghanistan, Pakistan, through Pakistan and Iran, down to the east coast into South Africa, some for those local markets, but then to be trafficked onward from there. And that's an old trade route. So that's heroin is being moved on dhows that have been trading products on that route, licit and illicit, for hundreds of years now, and is very interlinked with the ivory trade going all the way back to the 1800s as well. So we expected there to be more linkages here than we found. And I guess it's particularly because the wildlife products are moving offshore there and the heroin is moving onshore. And we did find there are a few cases where the networks are sort of involved, but it's not entrenched. And we found it to be a lot less convergence at the network level there than we expected. And we looked hard for it. The third one that was poaching networks in South Africa. So our two main the exceptions that we found to a lot of our overall sort of our generalizations were in South Africa, which has a very long-standing and entrenched criminal economy. And here we found that the poaching networks are often involved in other types of violent crime, cash and transit heists, kidnapping, assassinations. And when poaching becomes more challenging, we see them switching between these different crime types, basically. So a few words on abalone in South Africa and the network convergence. This was particularly interesting, and abalone has been around for a long time, the abalone trafficking. So what we found is that the source networks where the poaching occurs, mostly in the Western Cape and the Southern Cape, so the very bottom of South Africa, we found that there's convergence between drugs and violent extortion. So the local gangs are often very involved in buying or sometimes actually running the poachers that go out and collect abalone, but they're also involved in the drugs and violent extortion criminal economies as well. The trafficking networks then get involved in both drugs and violence. So what we found is that there's normally these quite entrenched Asian networks based in South Africa that are trafficking the abalone across to Hong Kong. And they are often involved in either the distribution of drugs in South Africa, sometimes more recently, it seems the importation of drugs, so for cocaine coming in from Brazil, as well as in the violence economy as well. So that could be assassinations and violent extortion as well. And here we found an integration of licit and illicit economies, and particularly linked to value exchanges. So there's Asian networks bringing in sometimes chemicals which legally, which then become the precursors for drugs that are manufactured, synthetic drugs that are manufactured in South Africa. They get involved in that manufacturing and then do a value exchange of those drugs with the drugs gangs in the Western Cape that are supplying the abalone. And we had an example of a drug exchange that was basically, actually it wasn't synthetic, but it was cocaine that had been imported and was exchanged for a volume of abalone on the road between Cape Town and Johannesburg. And here, as an exception, we see very strong vertically integrated control, where those Asian networks are very aware of how much abalone is coming in from different places. And so it becomes very hard for law enforcement to penetrate these networks with buying operations because they know how much should be coming in from different places. Hub convergence, we looked at airports in Mozambique, Maputo, Nampula, and Pemba. And everywhere we looked there, we were able to find that a corrupt facilitator, often a police officer, but sometimes an agriculture control officer who you went to, whether you wanted to move cash to Dubai or gold or illicit wildlife or sometimes drugs, you're traveling drugs, there was somebody that you could go to and they would help you through that airport. And relatively easily, we were actually able to get a hold of the phone numbers of a lot of these people. We saw the same thing at Avato Airport and at the seaport, Mahajanga Seaport in Madagascar, which is an important route, sea route from Madagascar across to East Africa. And in these places as well, like in Mahajanga, we found the same facilitator where if you were trafficking supporting the movement of people who wanted to move from Madagascar to the Comoros to get to the French island of Mayotte, you used the same facilitator in Mahajanga. It was actually a private sector facilitator there. It was somebody who was involved in the what's the word I'm looking for? Getting goods and dealing with your taxes when you move goods, ship goods. That same person would help with whether you were moving people to the Comoros, whether you were moving cannabis across to East Africa, or whether you were moving high-value illicit tortoises, live tortoises from Mahajanga to Comoros and then on to East Africa, and then they get flown to Southeast Asia. And the same in South Africa. Actually, this was more speculative. This wasn't something that we looked at, but just by chance we came across as well. Again, a private sector packing company that was involved in, and we came across it through abalone. Basically, there was an abalone delivery going there, and then there it was clear that drugs were being packaged in the same place, rhino horn was being packaged in the same place, and that was being shipped out of Oliver Tambo Airport in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we also came across something else where at the inspection point for passenger baggage, it was possible to pay a small bribe, a relatively small bribe really, to move drugs goods through that airport. We weren't able to follow up on interviews on that, but in discussions with other law enforcement officers, it seems that rhino horn moves exactly the same way through with the same low level bribes, and the low value of that bribe suggests that there's a high quantity of goods moving through that scanner. And looking at convergence, the broker convergence, in northern Mozambique, we were looking at lion body parts. We know there's a lion body part market coming out of the Nyasa Reserve in northern Mozambique and going across to Malawi, which used to be a major transiting hub for illicit wildlife products going to Asia. And we went to look at this, and we found that there is still trafficking of lion body parts across to Malawi. And there are also gemstone trafficking coming out of the same reserve. There's artisanal mining in Nyasa Reserve, and those gems get taken to Malawi and then certified as Malawian gems before they are exported. And that there we found it's the brokers, it's the people who come in and they say they want to buy the lion products. They go to the artisanal miners, and there's this overlap between the brokers basically. And what's got linked into that is the use of pesticides for poisoning carcasses for killing lions as well. So these pesticides are brought in as poisons from Malawi, and then that's linked all through these brokers who basically do the buying and selling of these goods and transport it back to Malawi. I'd spoken earlier about RWT in the heroin economy, where we didn't find it very strongly in the networks, but we did definitely find it linked at the broker level. So whenever we looked for either illicit wildlife, or we were talking to a broker about illicit wildlife products or about heroin, they were able to source the other one or knew how to source it as well. And then we found an interesting overlap actually, and it sort of comes up a bit as convergent between IWT and the recruitment to violent extremism in Nyasa Reserve. So with that Islamic insurgency in northern Mozambique, one of the things we found was that this link between the law enforcement action that had been taken in Nyasa Reserve and the recruitment of those people. So we found that people have been involved in ivory poaching, had then, when ivory poaching was clamped down on in the Niassa Reserve, they moved to artisanal mining, and the law enforcement strategies used to address the illegal artisanal mining, which were to destroy camps, to burn camps, to take away people's goods, and they were quite humiliating in how that happened. And people felt, and the link to the local corruption by local district government officers, which meant that local people felt they had no, and particularly young men, felt they had no opportunity whatsoever because the money that's there for economic development was being misappropriated. They then turned and were recruited by this Al-Shabaab, which it's not linked obviously to Al-Shabaab in Somalia. It's the local Al-Shabaab, just meaning the youth. And they joined that Al-Shabaab insurgency in northern Mozambique. So we tied this work into some broader work we've been doing over the last couple of years, mapping the illicit flows in this region. Given time, I'm not actually going to get into that much, but because all this does really is just show the impact that insurgency really has had on the illicit flows, where we used to see a lot of goods landing into northern Mozambique and Musumba the Praia, where the insurgency was based for a while. And here we can see by 2021 that everything misses this area in northern Mozambique. All the illicit flows have now started to go around it. You can see these goods coming down from Dar es Salaam, and some drugs we used to come on those as well, and goods evading tax. And now you can see how they completely move all the way around. So you just see this big hole here that this insurgency brought in. All right, so actually, I'm not going to go through this given time. I'm just going to go to the end where the recommendations that came out of our interviews as well. So having spoken to 105 different people, we went back to a lot of people, particularly law enforcement officers, after this study, and we spoke to them like, what would you do? What are some of the things we should be doing to address this? And the first is deepen our understanding of the wildlife crime from a wildlife crime perspective of the value chain, basically. Where are the key points on the chain that we can have the maximum impact? Where can we target our actions? At the moment, a lot of effort is going into targeting poachers who are, and as I've shown, are very much at the lower end, and it's not where a lot of convergence is happening, except in key places in South Africa. The wildlife crime units and intelligence investigations units have had the most impact. And that comes from another piece of work that we've done over the last few years. So where we've seen major changes in wildlife crime in countries in Southern and East Africa, it's where these targeted units addressing the organized crime nature of wildlife crime have been based and have been successful. The key to them, though, is building their resilience to corruption and being penetrated, but also around leadership and sustainability as well, because they often work when a good leader is put in place and supported, but we need to look at that, how we can develop those systems for over the longer term. We need to continue strengthening the criminal justice system, particularly focused on local governance. So it's not only about criminal justice system to address wildlife crime, but it's actually to put in place a functioning criminal justice system at quite a local level so that there's a more structured and ordered society as well. And where there is support being given to local courts and local areas and local governance improving, we've actually seen declines in wildlife crime specifically. Proactive court monitoring has a role to play, and that's been extremely successful in addressing some of these more difficult organized wildlife crime cases. And there's quite a few cases that we documented on this. And that can be both passive, where people are just sitting and recording what's going on and understanding how the cases are playing out, and then putting in place capacity building activities, or impacting on, or even giving input into how legislation can be strengthened in the future, but also active. So there's been cases, for example, in Malawi, where ambassadors have been present in court when they've known that there's corrupt activity happening, and it makes it impossible for the magistrate to actually to come up with something that doesn't follow the law, basically. And there's recordings where a broker for the organized criminal was speaking to somebody with a link to the magistrate and saying, basically, we can't do anything. There's too much focus on this case. Clearly from this work, we need to target the corrupt facilitators. Hub convergence, we found hub convergence everywhere, and that's all being driven by corrupt facilitators. And we need to target them and the money launderers. And if we can just use that 80-20 rule, 20% of the people are doing 80% of the bad stuff. We need to target those 20% of those people. Informal networks between law enforcement and criminal justice systems worked best. So that was from another study we found when looking at transnational organized crime. It wasn't by putting in place these MOUs and high-level agreements between countries that organized crime groups got broken. It was when there were trusted relationships between law enforcement officers at a local level, and then they used MLAs to exchange evidentiary material, etc. But the key thing is those informal networks across borders, for law enforcement across borders. And then the formal systems for transnational cooperation can be built on top of those. So rather, instead of putting in place these clever agreements, let's rather follow the work. Where law enforcement officers are talking to each other, where they want to build cases, that's where we need to put in place the formal systems. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, for your presentation. We remind attendees to put their questions in the Q&A box, and the best panelists will respond to you in the final 15 minutes of the webinar. Our next speaker is Andrei Simov, who's an assistant professor of the Department of Criminal Procedure and Forensic Science at the Irkutsk branch of the All-Russian State University of Justice. Before Andrei became a professor, he was working at the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia from 2002 to 2019. And today, Andrei will present his research titled Silent China's Mafia Invasion to the East Siberian region, Issues, Lack, and Local Enforcement Opportunities.
Thank you very much. Siberia at all, and especially East Siberia region, traditionally was marked as one of Chinese interests. It explains by historical and economical ways. On the one hand, the East Siberia lay near the Silk Road, which was the famous trading and logistic way from China to Europe. There traditionally were many hunters, smugglers, merchants, out migrants. Line between legal and illegal activity was very thin in all times. On the other hand, East Siberia is a rich region. In this area, fur trappers, gold, silver, lead miners, and other were usual. In this territory were forced labor camps a lot. That's why criminal rates there is traditionally higher than in other regions of Russia. Nowadays, Irkutsk Oblast is the center of East Siberia region. On this territory settled those of extractive industries. Some of them are abandoned, but officially part of them you can buy or rent. Criminals use this situation for timber, coal, gold, and jade illegal exporting. Separately, issue is an illicit tourism industry of Chinese people. In some places, you can see, in fact, China's possession villages, hotels, lands that let out to Chinese tourists or workers with false legal formalization and tax avoiding. Of course, straight illegal property use or resource export are impossible due to Russian legislation. This kind of illegal activity requires hiding financial and intelligence sources. Russian criminals commit this kind of crime alone not so often. That's why in this activity field, Russian citizens play with Chinese mafia together. Some of these criminal schemes were solved, but most of them are still working. Main offender in this criminal business, of course, Chinese citizens, but they tend to escape law enforcement attention. There are lots of reasons of it. For the last few days, above-mentioned scenes looks like a silent foreign invasion, which widespread consequences as a huge, like a huge deforestation, local climate changes, water and soil pollution, black markets dawn or rising. Indigenous unemployment growth are most typical of these issues. I will try to describe main problems with it. I will show some crime commitment schemes and propose some ways to solve it. We have studied police reports, operative reviews on the subject, interviewed operatives who directly deal with law enforcement duties in this field. We also studied media reports and interviewed indigenous groups, but just a few. We have to admit that unfortunately we face on a lack of official statistic data, at least relevant statistic data. As a result, we noticed a tip and an iceberg of its issue and may describe typical features of China's illegal activity in our region. So, what if we look at the core of the China's illegal activity? In the beginning, we should pay attention to how illegal system of financial operations which living in East Siberia Chinese citizens deal with, is designed. In big cities of region, Chinese firms are opened officially. These outfits do service in typical fields like Chinese markets, hotels, recreation centers, cafes, restaurants, and other. Many of mentioned outfits are opened with a criminal activity goal too. Firstly, these substantial outfits are created with money laundering goal, but it's hidden under legal activity. As per operative reports, we may claim that up to 80% of declared earning of it is laundered money. Secondly, in these places, illegal activity provides in Chinese people to Chinese people format. There are several popular types of it. For example, gambling, sex trade, unlicensed healthcare service, law service, employment intermediary, and credit accommodation. It's more. It's quite interesting to figure out how the gray money transactions between Chinese people, including credit accommodation, are working. For example, money transactions are provided by hard money payments, including local money exchange, with special receipt creating. You may present or surrender for payment in any another similar Chinese places, which exists in the Russia, and get your cash money back. That's how great Chinese banking system appears and works in Russia. The same way, Chinese people to Chinese people and other services in Irkutsk Oblast are provided. For example, healthcare service, it includes full-bodied hospitals with outpatient observation, simple surgical facilities, childbirth assistance, and other. These places include common medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, often suspicious origin and illicit for trade in Russia. Next sample is touristic and logistic service, which include all-inclusive medical insurance and other. Another one is a telephone and internet providing. It works on commercial base in format Chinese to Chinese people, but with avoiding of official Russian providers' tariffs. All in all, there are full-bodied hubs of base illegal infrastructure are designed. Chinese people for Chinese people, where they can loan and spend the money, take basic social services without any kind of official Russian society integration and Russian language usage. Due to above mentioned illegal system of financial operations, the same activity stays behind Russian legislation and financial monitoring. How it's possible? The terms of Chinese illegal activity lay in behavioral features fields. It connects with cultural aspects, and Russian legislation and law enforcement practice lacks and drawbacks either. Firstly, Chinese culture is substantial, different than Russia or any kind of European or American. I mean, South and North American, both. Chinese citizens who arrive to our region have significant problems with adaptation and assimilation due to cultural borders. In addition, Chinese society and government not welcome this kind of assimilation. As a result of it, excessive requirements for illegal service appears because legal Russian services are hard to receive freely, for example. Secondly, Russian education and social integration programs for foreign students are developed very slightly. Official arriving Chinese students are usually live in isolated groups without widespread connections with Russian native speaker students, and when study ends, they usually back home without friendship or relationship in Russia. Thirdly, although existing Chinese-Russian borders is complicated for official crossing, there is alternative modus operandi for Chinese people who once arrive in Russia quasi-legal. There was, through post-Soviet countries, especially Kazakhstan, arriving in Kazakhstan from China is much easier than in Russia from China. If you came to Kazakhstan and made local documents, your way to Russia will be quite simple, thanks to Eurasian Economic Union Convention between Russia and Kazakhstan. This scheme supplies a stable flow of illegal Chinese migrants to Russia and our region. This flow is estimated approximately in tens of thousands of people per year. It overflows official count of Chinese migrants in several times. Fourthly, integration between Russian and Chinese law enforcement is weak. For example, Irkutsk Oblast police submits over 1,000 requests annual as per Interpol coordination. Irkutsk police haven't been receiving any official response from Chinese police during at least 10 years. In addition, this type of working is impossible due to Chinese clanship, main difference, and totally non-acquaintance of Chinese language among Russian operatives. In what connection all above mentioned with environmental crimes in East Siberia and Irkutsk Oblast? As our research shows, crimes related with illegal natural resources extraction in East Siberia and Irkutsk Oblast for local Chinese mafia are not more than the way to earn illegal money for another more sufficient project developing. In fact, all common conditions for its illegal activity was created, and local law enforcement haven't anything to oppose to it. There are illegal habitation, medical care, money laundering, and other systems. At the same way, law enforcement are poor inquired about this illegal activity, or haven't sufficient resources and equipment, or aren't mind to overlook it in exchange for reward. The schemes of Chinese mafia environment crimes commitment are typical. Activity field related with the environment is chosen by criminal ad hoc. It may be logging, coal or gold mining, jade extraction, or any other kind of activity. It depends on goals of criminal groups, existing opportunities, or local authority corruption. After that, they find a Russian citizen partner who directly set up entity and make requires documents. It substantial reliefs, legal body registration, tax payments, and staff employment. As partner role are playing fictive or real wives, real or fictive Chinese wives, Russian wives. Criminal related Russian business partners, including enrolled by Chinese mafia during China visiting or business making Russian citizens. Sometimes homeless people play this role too. More often than not, this activity is started for illegal extracting natural resources legislation, for example, timber, coal, gold, jade, etc., without continuous sending for selling. In Russia, immediate illegal activity in the vast majority of cases is made by indigenous. This scheme typically includes the counter agents network, one-day companies, for example, using machinations with financial and taxes reports, cash withdrawal, money laundering in above mentioned centers and other. So what we're able to do? We need to start criminological regional researches of Chinese mafia. We have to recognize that nowadays is a blind spot for us. It's not just all about statistics, but anthropological researches, which, for example, Dina Ziegel haven't been doing for years in Europe. Chinese migrant programs for legal arriving and assimilation in Russia, society development is required. Of course, we are able to develop these programs with Chinese government partnership on federal Russian authority level. We have to create with Russian Chinese partnership a plan of law enforcement reaction for Chinese criminal activity, including Interpol data exchange and maybe creating some special departments in Russia law enforcement structure. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrei, for your very interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Andrei Aranega, who is an independent researcher who graduated from the Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Andre has published several academic publications focusing on various areas from international security and geopolitics to illicit trade and organized crime. Today, he will present on transnational organized crime and environmental crimes, categories, dynamics, and consequences to state and non-human communities. Andre?
So good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Aranega, and I'm delighted to return in this new edition of the 24-hour conference to discuss some of the topics explored in my master's thesis in international relations, which focused on issues related to transnational organized crime and environmental crimes. So basically, drawing from scientific papers, academic books, institutional reports, and news articles, this presentation offers a concise overview of these topics, divided into three parts. First, we begin exploring the major categories of transnational environmental crimes in order to take a deep dive into its network dynamics and global patterns of illicit environmental flows between the global south and north. In conclusion, this presentation highlights the profound and potentially irreversible effects of transnational environmental crimes on states and humans and non-human communities. First and foremost, it is crucial to know that even though there is no single definition for organized crime or transnational organized crime and various theoretical frameworks to study this phenomena, much of the literature describes them as, respectively, criminal enterprises and the illicit counterparts of multinationals. So basically, accordingly, these entities are primarily driven by power and profit, participating in various illicit markets throughout the world, and usually with very distinct organizational structures. Not by chance, environmental offenses emerge as a distinguished modality of an illicit market in this context, similar to the previous concepts. Whereas there are several legal frameworks and no universal definition of environmental crime and transnational environmental crime, some definitions hint at some of its most relevant characteristics. They are terms referring to illegal acts that harm the environment or that breach national and international environmental laws, the deliberate evasion of environmental laws and regulations by individuals and companies in the pursuit of personal financial benefit, the cross-border trading of species, resource, waste, or pollutants in violations of prohibition or regulatory regimes established by multilateral environmental agreements, or in contravention of national law. Or more generally, they are forms of transnational crimes where criminal entrepreneurs enjoy opportunities to gain substantial profits by plundering and destroying the Earth's flora and fauna. As for its major categories, illicit logging and timber trafficking, illicit mining and trafficking precious metals, wildlife trafficking and poaching, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, waste disposal and trafficking, and the illegal trade in ozone-depleting substances stand as the most famous and well-documented forms of transnational environmental crimes. All of the previous environmental offenses have very specific drivers. For example, differences between price and cost arise when expected profits from illegal trade surpass legal trade, when demand for legal products outstrips supply, and when regulations can be bypassed with illicit methods. Additionally, there are situations where regulations meant to correct market flaws or protect the public don't achieve their intended goals, while there are also instances where law enforcement agencies fail to effectively enforce the law and protect citizens. But of course, this should come as no surprise, given that we are dealing with offenses that share notable similarities with other forms of transnational criminal activity. First, as our world has grown more interconnected in recent decades due to the modern effects of globalization, criminal groups and networks engaged in environmental crimes have expanded their transnational reach. These organizations exhibit business-like traits, providing illegal goods and services to fulfill specific demands. They consist of a diverse mix of state and non-state actors, all collaborating at each stage of different illicit environmental supply chains, which are highly characterized by their network dynamics that frequently bridge very specific geographic locations abundant in natural resources right in the global south to wealthiest cities of the global north. And of course, these offenses are also closely linked to converging crimes like drugs and arms trafficking, money laundering, extortion, corruption, fraud, and even biopiracy. Having discussed their key drivers and the similarities with other forms of transnational criminal activity, we should redirect our attention to the activities and actors involved in each stage of illicit environmental supply chains, especially if one wishes to really grasp the global picture of transnational environmental crimes. In the initial stages, primarily in the global south source zones, activities such as poaching, live capture, cutting off trees, fishing, mineral extraction, and waste disposal are carried out by distinct players like poachers, loggers, fishermen, prospectors, legitimate enterprises, disposers, armed groups, and even corrupt local officers. In transit zones, spanning both global south and occasionally global north countries, activities like carving, tanning, document fraud, bribery, concealment, smuggling, and even money laundering take place, involving manufacturers, designers, smugglers, brokers, even shipping companies, custom agencies, fraudsters, financiers, and corrupt border officials. And finally, in consumer zones, primarily in the global north, there is the consumption, purchase, or use of illicit environmental products, with market controllers, vendors, traditional medicine practitioners, wildlife restaurant owners, consumers, and entertainers fulfilling their demand. Now, as you all might expect, beyond regional and local trends, which are very valuable, it is essential to recognize the global patterns of illicit environmental flows that link various regions of the world. In the Asia-Pacific region, Southeast Asia stands as a global supplier of illicit logging due to global timber and palm oil demand, with Indonesia, Myanmar, and Malaysia as key source countries, for example. Additionally, in this region, with countries like China, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and India, they all play a pivotal role in wildlife trafficking, driven by demands for traditional medicines, exotic pets, and luxury items. Of course, the first two of these countries being consumer countries, and the latter source countries. And furthermore, in the case of waste disposal and trafficking, China, India, Bangladesh, and Vietnam are all key source countries. Meanwhile, much of the African continent, especially South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Nigeria, for instance, serves as a primary source for wildlife trafficking. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, and Cameroon, with their vast rainforests, are major hubs for illicit logging, while the mineral wealth of Angola, the Central African Republic, Congo, Liberia, Ghana, and even Sierra Leone, for instance, has made them strategic sources for illicit mining. In West Africa, country examples such as Nigeria, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast is a significant destination for the illegal dumping of electronic waste from developed nations. But in Europe, on the other hand, with countries like the Balkans, Spain, and Italy, they act as both a destination and transit hub for wildlife trafficking. In countries in Europe, they also import a substantial amount of illegal illegal timber from Southeast Asia and the Amazon forest, even though there are significant sources for illegal timber within the Eurasia region, such as Russia. But in European countries, it is important to highlight that they also illegally import illegal minerals from many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Last but not least, it is important to mention that Mediterranean countries are major sources of illegal fishing, while Germany, the UK, and Italy are notable sources of waste disposal and trafficking. Furthermore, similar to Europe, North America serves not only as a major source for the illegal export of electronic waste to developing nations, but also as a destination and transit hub for wildlife and timber trafficking, especially from Southeast Asia and South America, as well as for precious minerals. And at last, Latin America and the Caribbean stands as focal points for illicit logging, illicit mining, and illicit fishing, wildlife trafficking, driven by global demands, especially in the Amazon forest. But in conclusion, the global picture of transnational environmental crime is often clear. Except for waste disposal and trafficking, consumer countries for the majority of transnational environmental crimes are largely located in the global north, whereas source countries are mostly present in the global south, and transit countries take on alternative shapes depending on the case. In other words, in most cases, the global north usually acquires timber, animals, plants, fish, and minerals from the global south, while in return, the biodiversity and resources of the latter are essentially exchanged for waste from the former. Finally, in wrapping up this presentation, it is crucial to underscore the severe repercussions of transnational environmental crimes, especially considering their capacity to literally destroy our planet's ecosystems and eliminate the necessary conditions for human and non-human existence. Illegal fishing, for example, reduces fish stocks and state income, impacts the livelihood of indigenous and local communities relying on fishing. It jeopardizes legitimate business, marine ecosystems, local fishermen's safety, sustainable fish consumption, fishery management, and increases the risks of driving exotic species to extinction. Illicit logging, on the other hand, destroys global forests and biodiversity, diminishes carbon sequestration potential, disrupts the hydrological cycle, encroaches on indigenous peoples' land, increases global temperatures, air pollution, and deforestation levels, displaces local communities living in forest areas, and reduces state revenues from countries relying on legal timber trade. As for wildlife trafficking, we can certainly understand that it damages ecosystems, biodiversity, and habitats, leads to the loss of exotic species, spread disease, introduces invasive species to unfamiliar habitats, and even erodes cultural and spiritual values tied to wildlife and shared by local communities. Illicit mining increases water, land, and air pollution and deforestation. It intensifies soil erosion, reduces oxygen levels, exposes human and non-human communities to toxic chemicals. It undermines legal mining operations, and even increases the risks of extinguishing various plants and animal species. The illegal waste sector amplifies greenhouse gas emissions. It scales the number of unauthorized landfills and storage areas, releases more black carbon and pollutants, increases air, land, and marine pollution, spread diseases and health risks, and contaminates soil and groundwater. And at last, in the case of the illegal trade of ozone-depleting substance, it is important to highlight that they destroy the ozone molecules, increases the vulnerability to solar ultraviolet radiation and health risks. They damage marine organisms and plants, and even disrupt climate patterns and crops. Well, though this presentation offered just a snapshot of the primary categories, dynamics, and impacts of transnational environmental crimes, I hope you found it informative and indeed alarming as it should be. If the global community aims to navigate the challenges of our near future, especially as climate change and transnational organized crime continue to reshape our surroundings and daily lives mutually, we need increased academic focus, political and corporate accountability, civil engagement, and financial investment to address these issues. Thank you very much once again for your attention. And if you have any questions or thoughts on the topics covered, I am eager to discuss them during our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Andre. For our last speaker, we have June Sohang. He's a lecturer at Sung Kong Ho University, and his presentation will address the trends in criminalizing environmental direct actions in democratic societies. And he will discuss to what extent civil disobedience organized by environmental campaigners should be accepted as self-defense. Jun Seo, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we are running short of time, so I'll try to go through my presentation very briefly. So again, my presentation title is about crimes that are committed in the name of nature. We are now witnessing different types of environmental direct actions in democratic societies, but in parallel, we are also witnessing governments are moving towards the criminalization and policing those kind of actions in a more violent way. So my question, based on these kind of observation, was to what extent can we justify these kind of environmental direct actions, and why do we have to accept them, or why should we not accept some kinds of? So So I will go through first the definition of environmental direct actions will be provided, and then I'll move on to overview what kind of legal reactions have been taken to different kinds of environmental direct actions, and then finally I'll try to propose kind of this law that can protect or sometimes regulate socially acceptable environmental direct actions. Right, so basically in this presentation, I will define environmental direct actions as disruptive activities that are motivated by environmental campaigners, basically based for environmental goals, values, to raise public awareness sometimes, to protect the environment, or sometimes directly stop policies that may be harmful to the planet. So usually when we talk about environmental crime, we tend to think about crimes against nature, but also there are crimes associated with the environment. And in this case, in my presentation deals with the latter. So we are witnessing different types of environmental direct actions. One of them is civil disobedience, actions that usually refuse to obey certain laws, but not the whole system, social system, but only certain laws or social orders. And civil implies non-violence. And similarly to civil disobedience, we have civil resistance, usually that refer to actions that challenge authority or regime. So this is more proactive than civil disobedience in terms of opposing to the government per se or the regime. And sometimes it can transform into activities that may be associated with violence, kind of violence. So sometimes civil resistance can overlap with eco-terrorism. And finally, eco-sabotage. Eco-sabotage explicitly aims to destroy facilities or other infrastructure, or sometimes mobilize kind of violent actions to stop activities that may be harmful to the environment. So we do have some environmental organizations that use these kind of eco-sabotage tactics in the global north. I'm not going to spell them out in this presentation, but many of them are being charged with criminal offenses against the property rights, and also some of them are actually listed as terrorist groups in the United States and some other countries. So the question is, how can we define, how can we draw a boundary line between different types of environmental direct actions? As we are witnessing the planetary crisis, more and more environmental campaigners are being mobilized, and also they use different tactics and repertoires. And then, but still, the law hasn't changed and has failed to respond to proportionately different types of environmental direct actions. So we are looking at the map where different types of environmental justice movements have been organized. So this map is not exhaustive, but people have registered their own stories and news about environmental conflicts in their countries and other societies. So these are a lot already, but we will see an increasing trend in terms of more environmental direct actions and movements. Then how can liberal democracies, especially, I'm not talking about like authoritarian regimes, but how can liberal democracies respond to these kind of social movements and disruptive activities? For now, liberal democracies like the UK government and the United States and and Germany, those kind of liberal democracies have responded to environmental movements which use disruptive activities by criminalizing or enforcing the law against them. For example, Germany raided down a climate activist group for their violent actions against the property rights and also public security. And the UK government is going to propose a new bill that grants the police to directly stop strikes or civil gatherings if they are being violent and disruptive. but the criteria for being disruptive is vested within the police. So that there are debates going on about whether liberal democracies are being authoritarian in terms of dealing with disruptive activities organized by environmental campaigners. But then why environmental direct actions are being organized and why they are using this kind of disruptive activities? Basically, there is a logic that we are living in a state of emergency. So like, for example, climate emergency, planetary crisis. So while the planet is collapsing, environmental campaigners believe that this should be justified, their activities should be justified to raise public awareness and also expose loopholes in our social system, which fail to deal with the planetary emergency. So that's why they try to disobey with the law sometimes, because they believe the law actually serves capital and the powerful of the society, who actually benefit from the ecological collapse. So some environmental theorists and campaigners even see liberal democracies are very slow, ineffective, and sometimes very skewed to the powerful of the society. So that's why they believe environmental direct actions are necessary to protect nature. And so that's why they believe their actions are justifiable. So criminal charges should not be imposed on themselves, but rather criminal law should be revised to charge criminal offenses against those who destroy the environment. But sadly, liberal democracies have not been responsive to those kind of claims. So now we are now witnessing more social conflicts between environmental campaigners and the national governments, even in liberal democracies. So I will briefly overview what kind of legal reactions have been taken to different types of environmental direct actions. So basically, those who are in favor of environmental direct actions do not see these kind of activities as crime. So they believe this is kind of a self-protection, self-defense of our life, home, and family in a matter of urgency. So they tend to emphasize the right to life, environmental rights, etc. So their value is more emphasized on planet and life per se. Rather, in parallel, those who are against environmental direct actions tend to emphasize public order and property rights. So they believe even if activities that are non-violent, if they are against property rights, that should be criminal offenses. So we do have different types of environmental direct actions, as I said, but there are, so mainly eco-sabotage and armed resistance are being criminalized already. But now we're witnessing protest and disruptive activities are also being criminalized, and so that's how I see liberal democracies are being authoritarian. So you're looking at the pictures of different environmental activists who have taken, for example, like sit-in protest and also squatting, etc. But some of them, even if they try to be peaceful, some of them have been targeted by police violence. For example, Manuel Taran, he had a gun while he was trying to protect the trees, but there is no evidence, hard evidence, that the police had to kill him in the US. Okay, so I'll just move on to my final stage. So what kind of environmental direct actions should be socially accepted on what criteria? I think this question would raise more debates and public discussions in upcoming years. So I propose social meanings of environmental direct actions can be awareness, raising public voices, and also sometimes it is justifiable legal challenges, and it is a part of social political activism, so it should be protected as a free expression of political rights, civil and political rights. And then finally, it also takes a part in social protection by imposing pressure on groups that commit environmentally destructive activities. So when we look at these kind of meanings of environmental directions, we have a good rationale for protecting these kind of environmental activities. So then, so in contrast to the existing legal reactions taken by national governments in liberal democracies to environmental campaigners, we can prioritize, if we prioritize sustainability over property, then more environmental directions can be justified as free expressions of civil rights rather than being criminalized. So this shows that liberal democracies have, while they have emphasized like sustainable development or sustainability per se, but their criminal law has not responded properly to sustainability. So they are not ready to enforce sustainability. So for liberal democracies to enforce sustainability, they will have to be more open to different environmental directions. But of course, there may be a limitation. For example, like we cannot obviously cannot allow armed conflict or armed resistance in liberal democracies. So my final point before we finish this session, my final point will be that liberal democracies we're now witnessing international criminal law. It's changing. For example, so there is a global movement to criminalize ecocide as a serious environmental destruction. So if these kind of, and also the European Union is changing its directive on environmental crime in a more proactive way to include ecocide in its own criminal crime directive. So if this environmental crime has been actually neglected in many ways in many countries' criminal law, but if environmental crime can be more punished harshly, then environmental directions can be justified as self-defense or self-policing. So far, liberal democracies like especially Western countries and also Asian countries, I'm speaking from South Korea. So these kind of countries, while they tend to emphasize sustainability in the global politics, but actually at the national level, their criminal law has been very strict and harsh against environmental campaigners. So while discussions on environmental crime tend to focus on criminal offenses against nature, we also have to think about like crimes that are associated with the environment, because that way, because as long as we cannot protect our civil rights to protect the environment, it's quite difficult to enforce the law to protect the environment in general.
Thank you very much, Yunseo. Anyone else?
Well, many thanks for organization for its conference. It's a huge opportunity for us due to some political issues, economical issues, and other. I just want to show some kind of our problems in our region and to pay attention to of international community for our problems. Thank you.
Can I respond to that? I was really interested to hear Andrei's presentation and the similarities between the immigration of people from China in particular into Eastern Siberia is so similar to what we've seen over the last 20 years in countries in Africa. And that arrival of people in formal and informal ways, and then the link into the licit economy initially, and then sometimes how that moves into the illicit economy as well, and those closed networks that are very hard to penetrate and understand and work with, particularly for local authorities. It was really, the similarities were incredible to see. So thanks for your presentation, Andrei.
Well, I think this presentation was extremely informative as we grapple with the concept of what is environmental organized crime. And I think there's a long way to go, or maybe not, till we really catch the real perpetrators, the one who are causing the damage to our environments, whoever they may be. And I feel that our experts have a lot more information. So please feel free to find them online and contact them if it helps your work.